feel like this is another rite of passage. As a home cook, pho has always been on my bucket list of things to try, but to be honest, I was always a little intimidated by it because of the time and effort and cost that goes into making it. But since I'm off of work for a little while for the holidays, I decided now was a good time to do it. I usually like to experiment and make my own recipes, but with something as daunting as this, I wanted to try something more proven. So I looked around at different recipes online and settled at Kenji Lopez-Alt's recipe. The stuff that he's put on the SeriousEats website is always well tested and well proven, so I decided to roughly use his method. So obviously I'm not going to list the ingredient amounts and the total process of this recipe. I'm just going to link his recipe below, but I'll still talk through it for a few minutes and highlight a few of the things that I learned and experienced while following this recipe, and then of course we'll get to the taste test. By the way, I just started shooting at 30 frames per second again. For the longest time I was doing 60 frames per second, but I obviously don't really know what I'm doing, so just let me know what you think if you prefer this or you like what I was doing before. So the star of any good pho is the beef broth, and that's what we're going to start with, specifically charring up our onion and ginger over an open flame. And Kenji recommends using an oven rack on top of the stove grates, but maybe don't be an idiot like me and use one that's not flammable.
Perhaps we should stop allowing this man near open flames.
But yeah, just trying to get a char around all the edges to enhance the flavor of the stock, and I see why using an oven grate would be really helpful in this case. Jeez. But yeah, once you have that, it's time to gather all your beef. And yeah, you need a ton of beef bones and different cuts of beef to make this stock. Not the most economical thing to make in 2022, but I couldn't find any beef shin like he recommends in the recipe, so I just used some of this beef neck. I considered using beef shank, which is similar to shin, but I just didn't get it. I also bought some extra marrow bones because they were cheap and I love the taste of bone marrow. And then rounding it out with some oxtail and chuck roast and then some brisket. Once I measured all that out, I dumped it into my stock pot with all the aromatics, covered it in cold water, and then I'm just going to purge all the bones for 15 minutes in boiling water. You can see all that gunk that starts coming out. It's really good to get rid of this before you start making your stock. Just try to thoroughly rinse all the meat and bones, and then I put that back into a clean stock pot with some clean water. And then we've got our handful of dry aromatics, which is what makes pho taste like pho. Trying to be authentic, by the way, and using this gold rock sugar that I found at my Asian market. So I bring this to a boil again, and then Kenji recommends going for like an hour and a half until the chuck and brisket are tender. However, after an hour and a half, my brisket was still pretty rubbery. My chuck was starting to get tender a little faster, but still had a little ways to go. And at this point, it was almost midnight because I decided to start doing this around 9 p.m. like a moron. But I kept going until like 12:45, and the chuck was tender at this point, but the brisket still wasn't, and I really needed to go to bed, but I couldn't leave these meats braising in the stock overnight, which by the way, I was planning to make this stock overnight anyway. So I removed those to a container that I filled with water, and I was just going to finish cooking them tomorrow. And then I was going to transfer my stock pot to my induction burner so I wouldn't have an open flame going overnight, until I realized that the stock pot was too big to fit on the induction burner and it wouldn't stay on. So after a couple minutes of thinking, I realized that I have this thing called an oven, which is really good at maintaining a low temperature that I can keep something in overnight. So I placed this partially covered in the oven at 185 Fahrenheit, and it was time for bed. On the next day, my house was still intact, which is good news. And the aroma of the stock was amazing. It had come together beautifully. I added my brisket back into the stock for a couple of hours to get it more tender, and once I got to that point, it was time to strain out the stock and season it to taste. So I removed all the meat and bones from the stock and then poured the rest of the solids through a colander. The stock then went back into my rinsed out stock pot through a strainer to make sure all the solids were gone, and then I opted to pick the meat from the neck bones and the oxtail. It does take a few minutes, but those are some really good eats right there. Back at the stock, I wanted to make sure it tasted perfect, so I went for a few tastes and added a good bit more salt and a little bit more fish sauce, and even a couple pieces more of rock sugar. You do want this to be super well seasoned because it's going to be flavoring all the other stuff in your bowl. I even added some more salt and stuff after I ate my first bowl just because I think it needed it. But I want to keep that on the point of almost boiling because it needs to be warm enough to warm everything back up in the bowl. Which, speaking of, I went and prepped the rest of my toppings in the meantime. I just soaked my rice noodles in cold water for 30 minutes. And then I grabbed my fresh flank steak that I froze for about 30 minutes and tried to get really nice and thin slices off of this because they would be going into the broth raw. But those taste really good and tender when they're brought just to temperature to eat. I also sliced up the brisket and chuck into thin-ish slices to put into the soup as well. And then just gathered the rest of the fresh aromatics, some bean sprouts, some Thai basil, some cilantro, or if you're like me and you didn't realize you got Italian parsley instead, that, some lime wedges, some scallions, and then just some hoisin and sriracha sauce. So the way to do this is to put the hydrated noodles into the bowl and then pour over the really hot broth, and then just add the different meats and toppings as you like. Try to make it look nice and presentable because your eyes have to eat too. I left out the hoisin and sriracha at first because Kenji recommends trying the broth on its own. Understandably, he says that a good broth can stand on its own and doesn't need those extra flavorings, so let's see. This makes a ton, by the way. I think I separated this into 6 gargantuan portions. It probably more realistically should have been like 9 or 10. But if you're not going to eat this all at once or even in the same week, you can definitely freeze it. But I would recommend freezing the broth on its own in individual containers, and then just dumping each portion of meat and toppings into its own vacuum sealed bag and then freezing that as well. But as intimidating as this was, I don't think it was too bad actually. I didn't run into too many major problems, and that's partially because Kenji's recipes are really well written. But this is also pretty simple, it just takes a really long time and is really expensive. But let's go ahead and see what I think about how this tastes. This feeling never gets old. If you love to cook, you can probably relate. Bellying up to a dish that you spent so long on, put a lot of effort into, and in this case put a lot of money into as well, and then getting to see your hard work pay off. It's awesome. I know there's tons of different ways to make pho, but I definitely trust Kenji in his process. I can say this is probably going to be pretty authentic. Almost forgot my lime juice. Yeah, I've been waiting a whole day to try this, so I'm going to get right into it. Cheers. Whew, absolutely divine. I shouldn't have been expecting anything else. I mean, nothing beats that deep but clean flavor of this beef broth. It's one of my favorite things in the world. Let's try some of that brisket meat. And the chuck. This is comfort food to the max. I would definitely do this way more often if it didn't take the amount of work and money that this takes. But at least now I've got tons and tons of the broth and all the meat and toppings that I can freeze and enjoy whenever I want. Let me get a little bit of the sriracha in there as well as some of the hoisin. Kenji mentions that a good broth shouldn't need this type of flavor enhancement, but I mean, I still gotta try it both ways, right? Oh yeah, that's good. I mean, like he said, this can do without the extra flavors, but I don't have any Thai chili, so there's not much spice in here, so the sriracha really helps. And I don't mind the sweet kick of the hoisin either. So if you really love being in the kitchen, I would suggest doing something like this. Probably not for everybody. This is probably around as good as what you can get at your local Vietnamese restaurants, but I get satisfaction out of putting work into something like this and enjoying it myself. This is my time off for the year, so I do have a few more slow recipes coming out. Hopefully I can kick up the content just a bit as the year comes to an end, but this has been great. Thank you, Kenji, for this recipe. Thank you all for watching. Be blessed, and I'll see you next time. That is far more than I ever deserve.